Good morning. Morning, night.
Actually, I
heard you a very early morning.
It's 4:30 a.m. and I think you're going to see the sunrise over the Sydney skyline behind me.
It's absolutely gorgeous, actually, where you are. Well, I'm an urbanist, so I have this bias towards the skylines.
Where are you?
I'm in London, but I'm
London
originally from Colombia, so I always live in different time zones every time.
I grew up in Sydney, have been living in San Francisco, and then this week we relocated to Sydney.
Yeah, I heard that. But it's great that you started your conversation talking about a love story and how you connect climate change with the narrative of a love story, and also closed up with the love of your mom. So what I thought that your conversation is very scientific ended up being very emotional. So I'm very happy to hear
that. I hope that more scientists can speak with more emotion. I think we need that.
Absolutely. And how do you find this? I mean, I was very intrigued by the story of your mom, because sometimes we always end up with what actually really move us and drive us, but we always keep it like back in the back. So I wonder if you are taking any feminist take of your understanding of energy and climate change.
Oh,
ecofeminism has been in vogue. And I don't know to what extent that is helping you also to shape how you see things.
I think you would describe my engagement with environmentalism as brutalist. So I just try to brutally remind people of reality.
Your way of seeing reality?
No, I can define the reality as to, you tell me, or society, if you tell me what society would like, how do you achieve that level of energy in a way that doesn't produce carbon dioxide? Mm-hmm. So I just finished a book that said, well, what if we all want to live approximately as people do in America? And how do you make that look like a solution for climate change? And you can do it. You can't do it everywhere in the world. But that book was written trying to help Americans, the ones that don't believe in climate change, understand that they can fix climate change without suffering or denying themselves all of the luxuries that they believe the American dream entitles them to. I can also then say that I don't really think that looks like an astounding success for humanity, because we're going to create all of these we still keep an awful lot of consumerism in that vision for the world. So understanding that conflict, I probably would like to worship an eco-feminist Gaia with a better vision for eliminating the plastic fish, while we also address the fact that we can't have no energy, so we need to have some industrial economy and find a balance.
Yeah, but I wonder how, because we've been discussing a lot about climate change, but at the same time with the pandemic, I feel that it has created a disruption in how we even address and understand climate change at the same time, in terms of the sense of urgency of dealing with the health issues. But to what extent this pandemic has changed the perception of also understanding future itself? I think that our perception of how time behaves and what can we even consider as future has been largely transformed by the pandemic.
I don't know where I fall yet. I think it sounds to me that you have some optimism that the pandemic will help us deal with the climate change better.
I'm an optimist by nature, because I think we have to be, or at least
you have to be.
Yeah, we have to be. Surrender is not an option for me, and I believe that we should be pushing for the change. There's this saying that you be the change you want to see in the world, and I think we have to. There's no other way but thinking in how we can make things better, because there are already a lot of people doing it not very kind for the rest of humanity.
So I mean, I agree with you. I actually, I open a lot of my talks on climate change now and the book with a graph. So we all got used to understanding what bending the curve means because of COVID, right? So we take a little curve like this and you bend it down to keep under the threshold where hospital infrastructure fails. I think the curve of climate change is the same curve, but it's like 100 times larger.
Absolutely.
And so how do we bend that curve so we stay within the ecosystem limits and the infrastructure limits dictated by climate change? So I have some optimism that helps us a little, but I also think that is a very, very privileged position. I actually think that the pandemic has made far more, in a small number of relatively wealthy people who can afford to Zoom to work, aware of bending that curve. But I think a far larger number of people now have their lives more economically at risk. And I think once if you're looking for food, climate change doesn't matter.
No, that's right. I think in the research I have done recently in terms of what has been the community response, particularly in the self-built neighborhoods in Latin America, where I largely have been working on, the main concern is getting the food. That's the first thing. And sometimes we forget that are those basic needs and how then we need to start thinking and put it at the center, all the infrastructures that are required to produce and actually access food, right? And how do you think about proximity, production, consumptions, all this, the cycles that you require to do that. And of course, it's been bluntly the huge inequalities that we experience and how these conditions is just deepening that inequality that was already there in the first place.
You remind me I think what the pandemic has really exposed is the fragility of cities. And we've had a 50-year narrative, including with some bad data and some false assumptions, that cities are ecologically better. High density living is the right way to live. That has been sold to us as the correct thing to do. But I think the pandemic shows you how fragile cities are. I'm sure if you were living rurally, you at least have some opportunity to grow some of your own food. But in the pandemic, where the food problems are exacerbated, living in crowded cities is terrifying because you have no relationship with food. You have no possibility to go out and grow it.
Yeah, and all the sense of, eat locally.
Yeah.
All these ideas of the close proximity is also pushing us to question then how food distribution is operating, how many producer countries, because of the general geopolitics, end up importing food that they were in the first place able already to produce. But right. Bigger interest, then you end up really selling off the land of your country. But I'm very interested in your work in terms of the centrality that the energy has, because somehow I come more from a perspective of the colonialism or perhaps more anti-colonial. And I think the energy and the extractivist movements that for many centuries have been going on, I think have increased instead of decline. And I don't know, what is your take in all this dependency and very complicated relations between, the already very powerful and over-consumeristic societies?
I think my focus on energy is because we can't have no energy if we want to have some of the trappings of civilization, such as this phone conversation over an incredible internet. But I absolutely appreciate, and I was in Kenya last year, that there are people who live very happily, very frugal lives, frugal by Western standards, and we are still trying to force a colonial version of what the world should look like upon those indigenous people. That's still happening in a huge number of places in the world. And it's a destructive vision of the future that we're trying to sell those people. I actually thought a lot about it when we spent a lot of time with the Maasai. The Maasai live with their cattle. The Western environmentalist storyline regarding cows is that they are one of the chief evils of climate change. The Maasai have been living with their cows for a long time. They drink the blood and the milk. They mix it together. They're very proud of those traditions, and they have something that looks like a sustainable relationship with cows. But then you have to run the thought experiment. What if all of the world lived with as many cows as the Maasai? And that doesn't work either. So I have complicated and unresolved feelings about what the answer is to this question. And I also don't believe that we have the luxury anymore of having all of these cultures living in isolation without each other's influence. The world has gone past that point.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, if anything, the pandemic has shown how interdependent we are.
Yes.
In every front. And given, the centrality of energy for everything what we do, I think I struggle to think how to be sustainable, quote unquote, without being extractivist, and how we can encompass or make peace, understanding that there are other ways of being in the world. And we don't really need to be homogeneous or thinking in these more development ideas of we trying to achieve the lifestyle of the American dream, for instance. That would be a disaster.
Yeah, but
it is indeed already.
I'm in Australia, where the arrival of the indigenous people in Australia 50 to 200,000 years ago led to the extinction of the Australian megafauna. Mm-hmm. We would now look upon that by energy and technical standards as they were, very not very developed at all, and somehow we give privilege and say that they must have been living the right way. But you have to go back and ask yourself the question: well, they caused all of these extinctions. Whether is that any better or worse? So any human that is in any environment changes that environment enormously. So I think you're actually highlighting my own personal struggle, which is to understand where are the goalposts. I happen to think we need some energy and some luxuries and some follies, but we need to figure out where the compromise is. How do we keep enough of the natural world to not ruin it all?
Yeah, I think you mentioned before something about care, and I've been thinking a lot about care lately for obvious reasons. So would it be that some factor to consider when defining that kind of threshold or middle ground?
What do you mean? I can't remember what I meant by care, so you'll have to.
I think you said that you were mentioning that you can still try to decrease climate change and still killing the people or the species or the entity that we care for.
Yeah. The most extreme version of that is there's a lot of people that are advocates that it's solar technology and wind technology. That's not enough. That's naive. It doesn't give us enough of what we want. We need fusion. And with my technical background, I believe that fusion is achievable, and I think we probably will achieve it. Some people will get this joke in the next 20 years. But I always, when I think about fusion, I remember what my friend George Dyson said to me is that it's like, if we have fusion, that's going to be the worst thing ever. If it's really cheap energy, we're just going to move mountains for vanity, right? It's like, I don't like my view. Can we move that 10,000 foot mountain a little bit to the left? So infinite energy is probably a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. We'll polish the earth, as my father would say, until it's just like a mirrored ball floating in space if we have infinite energy. So when I talk about energy, it's understanding that more is not better, not necessarily better. I can say that too much is too much and too little is too little, and we're all struggling to find out what the thing.
But I think perhaps always the underlying question is about distribution, right?
Absolutely.
Too little, but for whom?
But I think that is I think the people who are concerned about that distribution are not even thinking quite enough about it. Let me turn that conversation on its head. You can't fix climate change if only the 20% of the wealthiest can afford to fix climate change. And I don't think the 80% or the 90% or the 99% that can't afford to themselves go out and buy the batteries and the solar cells, et cetera, to live this sustainable life are going to accept the world declining while the 10% can afford to be sustainable. And I think this is what some of the conservatives are very concerned about. But involved in the conversation about addressing climate change deeply and you can't unentangle the conversation with, you have to bring everyone along. And what does bringing everyone along look like? So I think that's actually the positive way to look at this problem. Whereas I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of negative framing of the haves and the have-nots, as opposed to, by necessity, fixing climate change means everyone has to have some more, or there has to be more equality, because there is no solution if only half of the world fixes it.
So are you embracing these ideas of climate justice then, as a kind of precondition or something that is structural to further or even imagine or invent any other technological solution, quote unquote? Or where do you see it? Because there are different movements and different strands that try to, in a way, bring the angle of a reading of power in trying to solve or sort out the climate change.
I'm very concerned that I'm going to say a whole bunch of things that are probably dangerous to say. I think the climate justice conversation is very important, but probably setting us back right now. And I think the climate justice conversation should be around, how do you bring everyone along, and then just address that, which I guess is maybe where the climate justice is. But climate justice right now seems to be framed in revenge. Whereas I think climate justice needs to be framed in the only pathway to success. And I'd like to see climate justice be said with positivity and love, because currently it's spat out with venom, and it's about revenge on the fossil fuel companies, revenge on the wealthy people who created this problem, revenge on the global elite. And I'm very concerned that the climate justice conversation puts us on a war footing, not on a figure it out together footing. And just
maybe is one of the stages, perhaps. I'm just thinking historically and the political conjuncture in the one we are at now.
Yeah, but I think climate justice, a lot of people might look behind me and think, what an incredible view. Wasn't that magnificent? I actually look behind, I disagree. I think this is these buildings, most of them are awful. If you look down below, there's some beautiful sandstone buildings. But I would prefer to live.
I could move a couple of them to see the sun.
I know. I don't have much choice. But
fusion energy.
That's right. But, do we really need all of these giant buildings? I'd prefer to live.
If you're working from home and you're not traveling and doing much tourism, perhaps those places are going to change radically.
I hope they change radically. We pour more than 1 cubic meter of concrete for every human on the planet every year.
And most of it is just a speculation. It's not for actually sorting the housing crisis.
Yeah, the Ponzi scheme of global real estate. Yeah, absolutely. And we create too many roads. And what is the most destructive human activity? It's building a road somewhere. Because as soon as you build a road, all of the other cancers of humanity follow that road. And so, I don't know, my personal view is like, I would like a lot less of all of those things and a lot more of nature. And I'd be prepared to live in a tent if I could have that compromise. The hotel room that I'm quarantined in reminds me of all the worst of humanity. Terrible middling quality furniture that is pretending to be Roman. Right. Couches made with horrible labor practices that are pretending to be, Ottoman from the the great that period. It's I'm not sure that set of consumerism is where I want to go. But to the climate justice conversation reminds me to something that I think I'm going to throw out a crazy big idea. So you hear this conversation that the 100 companies have created 80% of climate change, the 100 fossil fuel companies. I think this is a very disingenuous conversation because those companies were doing what we were asking them to do. We were giving them money and asking them to sell us fuels, and they did what we asked. So I think it's wrong to blame them, and it's a very convenient scapegoat over us. I think in the conversation about how do you fix climate change, we would like revenge against them and to tear them down. But what you have to remember is that they have already valued and put into all of the world's stock markets all of the fossil fuels that they have in the ground. So by necessity, if you set war on these fossil fuel companies, you're burning their assets, trillions of dollars worth of assets. And if we have a revenge mindset against them, we're all going to die because they will go down fighting. I don't believe there is a solution to climate change that doesn't involve bringing those companies around and on side and somehow forgiving them of those assets. And I was speaking to a much more learned person than myself recently, and he said, you know what the analogy to this is? Because I'm essentially proposing that we buy out the fossil fuel companies.
And we meaning the state, or we?
Yes, we meaning the state, we meaning the people. Mm-hmm. We invent currency to buy them out, and then they have a huge amount of capital, and we let them win in the development of the clean energy technologies for the future. For example, we need some grand compromise like that. And to get to the point, which I then think I'd love to hear your reaction to, I think we need that bargain, but that's not a very popular opinion with environmentalists. But then talking to somebody who is a much better student of history than me, he said, well, that's actually very analogous to the difference between how Britain dealt with slavery and how America dealt with slavery. Britain dealt with slavery, they actually bought out the slaves and they paid the slave owners out. America didn't.
And there you are.
And there you are. And that's why Britain did it 40 years before America ended in civil war. And it was because slaves were considered an asset, an hugely valuable asset. In no way do I want to equate slaves and fossil fuels, et cetera, but there's such vested interest that we need to figure a way out that's mutual. Otherwise it will end a little bit like the American Civil War and a huge amount of destruction. So
I wonder, now that you bring up to the equation slavery, now that is very tricky, and how many discussions are going on regarding racial capitalism and how the fossil fuel industry is kind of one of the key assets of this capitalistic system. I don't know to what extent even a perspective, like a racial perspective, would have to also be brought into the discussion, and how can you then do that bargaining with these companies, and who owns what, right? Who's doing the lobbying for putting the politicians, or how these politicians are actually ended up buying these companies? I don't know, there's like a very tricky political question there, right? Because who owns what is actually the very interesting question at the bottom of that. We have forgotten who owns what. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Queen owns an unbelievable portion. And you're in London.
And the Swans.
And I was my ancestors were excommunicated by her ancestors, so I have no love for the Queen. But she and her family owns a huge amount of the world's real estate. They pretend like they want to solve climate change. They sold most of these fossil fuel leases to the fossil fuel companies. They enabled this. Maybe to end, let's get a little punchy here, but unless we go down with the British monarchy, we don't solve climate change, because she's sitting on all of those fossil assets. If they actually fucking meant what they said, they would end, or the royal family themselves by decree would end all of their fossil leases today. Prince Charles, if he had any shred of decency as an environmentalist, would stop being a fucking hypocrite. And he'd have the whole family stop selling, underwriting all of this. The Catholic Church also owns a huge amount of real estate. There's you got to actually look at who owns who at the end of the day. It's not the fossil fuel companies that own it. They mostly just lease this stuff. You've got to look at the set of still actually colonial powers and royal families a few centuries deeper as the problem. So I think it's a little too easy to blame the fossil fuel companies.
Yeah, I think then we need a more complex genealogy of who owns what and who has the power to decide, and how are we going to change it, right? Because we've been voting wrongly.
I'm all for chaining myself to that fence and marching on those walls. I think fixing. I think it's a very deep question of who should own the land, and to me it ends with that wonderful. I think nearly every culture claims this quote, but the idea that you don't own the land, you're borrowing it from your own ancestors. And I don't know. I think if we could somehow turn that concept into the ownership structure of land, so you were never actually, none of us ever actually owned anything. We're always just borrowing it from our future descendants. Then maybe that's what we need to underpin your philosophy here.
Yeah, I think we need to alter significantly our connection with not only with land, but what nature means and what is the earth. So I think, I mean, we were starting our conversation with the love story, and I think we really need to go back to loving the earth and definitely changing the mindset of this very, Western thought idea that the humans are the center of the world and that we own the land instead
of. So we have 2 minutes. We got 2 minutes left. Let's talk about that love story. So what is the global religion that you're going to start that tells that story, or how are you going to do it? Sing me the hymn from the book.
The Gaia lovers, the Pachamama lovers. That is being already invented in many, many traditions. And if we are going to really listen to our ancestors, then let's be real about listening them. And let's try to really start bringing other voices. Because as long as we are with this all white supremacy, English-led only vision of that the US is the universal narrative about what is the aspiration of society, we only are killing our planet and ourselves. There's no future there. And since we are an optimistic crowd, then we need to be in creating this Pachamama lovers, pragmatic, technological, creative bunch of people that are already all around making wonderful things.
So that's great. We're going to end up violently agreeing here. So I think what I heard you just say is, we need a more seductive vision than the American dream. The American dream has dominated for 50 years, and that was the seductive vision. That was the North Star for us all to aspire to. So who is going to provide us with it has to be a much, much better story. And who is going to give us the love story of the new global dream that will supplant the American dream as our aspiration?
That's our job, of every one of us. I'm working on storytelling. I'm an architect, but I ended up working on storytelling to learn across cities. So for some weird reason, we are all going back to this very traditional way of thinking seriously about the storytelling.
Well, I love that we ended on storytelling. Thank you so much.
Thank you.